Stacey Abrams said this week, "There is no such thing as a heartbeat at 6 weeks." You know Stacey, she's running for governor and in Georgia. She went on to say, "It's a manufactured sound designed to convince people that men have the right to take control of a woman's body away from her." According to obstetrics and gynecological experts, Abrams is correct in saying there is no heartbeat at 6 weeks. At this stage of embryonic development, the chambers and the valves of the heart, the opening and closing of which create the heartbeat, simply don't exist. Abrams was arguing against the fetal heartbeat rhetoric in anti-abortion legislation. The term is used to contest abortion rights in Georgia and elsewhere. But doctors say that at 6 weeks there is no embryo, not yet a fetus. There is a grouping of cells emitting electrical impulses, not a heartbeat. I stand before you not as a female. I don't identify as a female, but as a white heterosexual male. That's why I thought it was so important to have women's voices this morning. In fact, in the United States, there is no question that I own my body. Most medical science has been done for the benefit of white male bodies. There's rarely been a question about whether white males own their bodies, just as there has rarely been a question about whether a heterosexual male, white male, can own land, open a checking account, buy a house, or any number of other rights. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito wrote in the Dobbs decision that the Constitution does not confer a right to an abortion. Thus, my friends, the implication is that the Constitution doesn't give women's rights over their own bodies. And the further implication is that women won't have bodily rights legally protected unless specific laws for their protection are passed. In effect, he's saying that women don't inherently own their bodies. Legislatures do. In July 4th, 2022 issue of the New Yorker, staff writer Gia Tolentino wrote in her article, "We're not going back to the time before Roe, we're going someplace worse." She says, "We have entered an era not of unsafe abortion, but of widespread state surveillance and criminalization of pregnant women. In the United States, where abortion has been or will soon be banned in many states, any pregnancy lost past a certain early cutoff now potentially could cause a crime investigation. Search histories, browsing histories, text messages, location data, payment data, information from period tracking apps. Prosecutors can examine all of it if they believe the loss of a pregnancy may be deliberate. Even if the prosecutors fail to prove that an abortion took place, those who are investigated will be punished by the process, liable for whatever might be found." Gia goes on and tells us of a woman Gladys Fisher, a resident of Mississippi. There was no evidence that Gladys Fisher took an abortion pill. She maintained that she experienced a stillbirth, an occurrence that happens in 1 in every 160 pregnancies in the United States. Nonetheless, she was charged with second-degree murder and held for several weeks on a $100,000 bond. The district attorney, Scott Cullum, had campaigned as a progressive reformer. Advocates pushed him to drop the murder charge and provide a new grand jury with information about antiquated, unreliable float tests that was used in her prosecution. If you don't know what a float test is, if the woman's egg sinks when it's put in water, it never had a chance. If it floats in water, it's mainly air and is not viable. But if it floats low, it's viable. That's the basis of the allegation that Fisher's baby was born alive. The grand jury declined to indict Fisher, but the ordeal took 3 years. This float test may remind you of the medieval test to determine whether a woman was a witch. She floated if she was, she drowned if she wasn't. Not really great choices. All that should chill you to the bone. I have publicly stated and will continue to state, as a religious leader, I believe that women have bodily autonomy. Women deserve every single right over their body from the moment they are born to the moment they die. Period. I feel so strongly about this that I am involved as a plaintiff with 4 other religious leaders in a fight to get HB 5 overturned, the law that the Florida legislature and Governor DeSantis passed to restrict abortion access. In my brief, it says HB 5, entitled the Infant and Fetal Abnormality Act, established as the law of the state of Florida, a pernicious elevation of the legal rights of fetuses, while at the same time it devalues the quality of life and the health of the woman or girl who is pregnant. It is in direct conflict with the plaintiff's clerical obligations and faith, and imposes severe barriers and substantial burdens to his religious belief, speech, and conduct. HB 5 violates the sacred trust between a clergy member and his or her congregants, and tramples the plaintiff's First Amendment and Florida constitutional rights to free speech and free exercise of religion, and his rights under FRFRA. Now, let me tell you what FRFRA is. The Florida Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which says Florida will not burden a person's exercise of religion. I went on to say it violates the separation of church and state under federal and state constitutions. A violation of the act constitutes a third-degree felony. Any person who willfully performs or actively participates in an abortion in violation of the law is subject to criminal penalties, including imprisonment of up to 5 years and monetary penalties of up to $5,000 for the first offense. My friends, I have been a Unitarian Universalist since 1979, and I am fully aware of the Unitarian Universalist position on reproductive justice, for I carry that within my heart. I know that the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations has put out statements that support reproductive justice as far back as 1987. At that year's General Assembly, our yearly denominational meeting, it was stated, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the right of the individual conscience, and respect for human life are inalienable rights due to every person. And that personal right to choose in regard to contraception and abortion is an important aspect of those rights. And the Unitarian Universalist Association didn't stand on just that. Many years they have put out statements, most recently 2015 and 2022, again affirming the rights of a woman's choice, a woman's autonomy of her own body as far as reproduction is concerned. And when Texas passed that abortion law in 2021, the Unitarian Universalist Association put out this statement: we believe that all bodies are sacred. Every body has the right to determine what happens to their own body at all phases of life, including if, when, and how they want to have a child. As people of faith, the commitment is part of our deepest religious values. Unitarian Universalism proclaims that all individuals and communities have the right to self-determination, safety, and the resources that are necessary for health and sustainability. My friends, we are not the only ones fighting this fight. As I said, there are 4 other religious leaders joining me in this legal fight in Florida. Clergy from the Jewish, Episcopalian, United Church of Christ, and Buddhist faiths are also plaintiffs in this lawsuit against HB 5. We, the clergy, and I decided to fight this law on religious grounds because an attempt to fight this law on individual liberty grounds was dismissed by the Supreme Court. It seems that the separation of church and state is not as well defined as it used to be. It seems religious grounds hold more standing in a conservative Supreme Court. I want to share with you briefly what some of my other colleagues wrote in their briefs. My Buddhist friend wrote, "A core tenet of Buddhism is the sanctity of individual choice while on the path of the Buddha. When the plaintiff counsels disciples on who can bear a child, the plaintiff believes that their life and spiritual evolution is paramount. Pregnancy, childbirth, family planning, and abortion are extremely integral decisions in life. As a Lama, the plaintiff must consider the individual circumstances of each disciple, including their karmic effect and their place on the path of enlightenment. Any inability to counsel and support a disciple's choices regarding abortion services and birth control prevents the plaintiff, the Lama, from being an effective spiritual guide and is anathema to the Buddhist path. The plaintiff believes that all Buddhists should use self-determination to make choices to access abortion services and birth control with no restriction on movement, autonomy, type, or timing." And my Jewish friend wrote in her brief, "Jewish law, practice, and core tenets are unequivocal that all life is sacred. As such, the decision to bring a new life into the world is a deeply religious one. While Judaism cherishes both actual and potential life, the physical and mental well-being of the mother always takes precedence over an unborn fetus. Interpretations may vary across Judaism, but this rabbi and many practicing Jews believe that the fetus is part of the parent's body and that the baby is only considered a person once it takes its first breath. And what about Unitarian Universalism, Christianity, and all the Protestant religions? You've heard some from Unitarian Universalism Perhaps we should understand a little better about what our Christian brothers and sisters, siblings, think of this. An article was recently written by Unitarian, well, not recently, about 2009, that's not recently, but by Reverend Scotty McClellan. He's not only a Unitarian Universalist clergy, he's a lawyer, and he was the dean of the religious life at Stanford University. He wrote, "There's nothing explicit in the Bible about induced abortion. Nothing. Only in Exodus is there a passage. And it says, when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so there is a miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines." A fine, not a punishment for a homicide. Scotty goes on to tell us about the history of the Catholic Church. There was no issue within the Catholic Church as far as abortion was concerned. St. Augustine in the 4th century adopted the Aristotelian belief that the human soul didn't enter the fetus until 40 to 90 days after conception. And it continued to progress from there until 1869, when Pope Pius IX proclaimed that the ensoulment of the child occurs at conception. And by 1917, canon law had been revised, dropping prior distinctions it had held between animated and inanimated fetuses. Pius's position has been maintained by the Catholic Church ever since. So we're talking, maybe 100 years. I thought it was important, too, to tell you a little bit about scientific and medical perspective. Fetal life is a magnificent continuum of development from cells, zygote, at the time of conception, to manifestation of the embryo at about 14 days, to the formation of what we call the fetus at about 3 months. Of course, those first 2 weeks, it's not clear that the zygote, these groupings of cells, will become an embryo, much less a human being. 2/3 of the time, the zygote doesn't develop into anything at all. Sometimes it develops into a tumor. Or it could become an embryo that splits in two and becomes twins. Once it becomes an embryo, it's a long time, another 22 weeks or so, before it reaches viability or the stage of development when it might survive outside the womb. I tell you all of this because I think we are empowered by knowledge. And we have to make our own choices. We will be impacted, we are impacted, by those of the far right-wing evangelical and Catholic theological concept of fetal parent personhood. The idea that from the moment of conception that the embryo or fetus is a full human being, deserving of equal, or more accurately, superior rights over the woman. This is the foundational doctrine of the anti-abortion movement. The legal ramifications of this idea include the possible classification of IVF, intrafertilization, IUDs, a device which prevents pregnancies, the morning after pill as instruments of murder, are unhinged and much harsher than even the average anti-abortion American is currently willing to embrace. Nonetheless, anti-abortion movement is now openly pushing for fetal personhood to become the foundation of U.S. abortion law. And yet, my friends, pregnancy is more than 30 times more dangerous than abortion. One study estimates that this nationwide ban on abortion will lead to 21% rise in pregnancy-related deaths. Some women will die from abortion bans are pregnant right now. And most miscarriages are caused by factors beyond the pregnant woman's control: illness, placental or uterine irregularities, genetic abnormalities. But the treatment of pregnant women, people in this country, also makes many of them feel directly and solely responsible for the survival of the fetus. They are told absolutely to avoid alcohol, caffeine, retinol, deli turkey, unpasteurized cheeses, hot baths, vigorous exercise, drugs that are not prescribed for them, and drugs that are prescribed for them, often without any explanation because of these shoddy laws. Structural factors including, but are not limited to, structural factors that lead to miscarriage are poverty, environmental chemical exposure, working late-night shifts. These are not discussed. More and more women can be sued, prevented from engaging in travel, or any activity that is believed to create risk for the life of the unborn. I know all of this is a lot to take in, and I'm aware that even in this congregation and all of our congregations, there are differences of belief about when a group of cells becomes a person. But what is different here in this community and in Unitarian Universalist congregations is that we understand and affirm that women have bodily autonomy. We accept and believe the findings of science and medicine. We don't believe it's a right or equitable to create laws that limit a human being's right to personal bodily autonomy. We understand and empathize with women who have to make the difficult decisions around pregnancy and childbirth. This is, in many ways, a safe place. As you think about all that I have said and all that you've heard and the questions I've asked, I have a few more things I want you to consider. Do you support personal bodily autonomy for everyone? And what does that mean for you? If you affirm personal bodily autonomy for everyone, how will you live that and affirm that in the world? Do you believe a woman has a right to choose whether to have a child? Now that might bring up other questions, perhaps questions that are not easy, questions that don't have a one-size-fits-all answer. If you support a woman's right to choose whether to have a child, what are you doing in the world to express that support? I cannot and I will not tell you what you must believe or what actions to take. That each of you must figure out for yourselves. But I believe strongly that none of us can sit on the sidelines on bodily autonomy and reproductive justice. And so I ask you, examine in your heart, talk with others you trust, and decide what you will do. That is what I charge you to do and to live in the world.